the white to move, I want to look at, what's going to stand out. We have a pawn ready to capture a knight or move forward. And in either case, that would discover the rook's attack against the king. So that looks incredibly promising. Now, one thing I'll notice is that our rook is hanging and that would attack the king. And we should also mention that the rook is pinned to its own king here. So we need to be alert regarding that tactical liability. Now, I noticed the queen is hanging, so that's really exciting to think about. But as I mentioned, our rook is hanging and that attacks the king. So if we move the king to, say, b1, now the rook can collect our hero there on c7. And when the smoke clears, although we have an extra queen, black is more than compensated by 2 extra rooks and an extra minor piece, not to mention a couple extra pawns as well. So this is not going in the direction we'd like it to. But it's good to at least look at kind of the direct point, like, okay, a queen is hanging. What happens if I capture it? Doesn't quite work out. Now, I think an even more tempting point is look at the pawn here. Only 1 square away from promoting. We could push the pawn or capture the knight. And in either case, we discover the rook's attack against the king. And that's where that tactical liability comes in. The rook is hanging, meaning it could be captured on the next move, and it's pinned to our own king. Why does that matter? Well, if we, say, take the knight and promote it into a queen, we're discovering a check against the king, but unfortunately, now we just lose our rook. Suddenly our king is under a lot of pressure, and a move like king b1 is well met by bishop to a2. The main point here is we're trying to attract the knight to capture the bishop, which would then open up the c-file, leading to a quick mate in 2 after queen to c1, taking advantage of that nice pin, unable to move our knight because of the rook here. Okay, so going back, we have to be very careful about pushing our pawn. Even though it feels great to promote the pawn into a queen, we need to be really careful about black's counterplay, starting with rook takes rook. I mentioned moving the king here is a big problem, as black is able to start attacking, and if we try to somehow shield the king, I don't know, say bishop a4, the problem here is that black can collect our newly promoted queen, and all of our pieces are starting to feel pretty bottled up. The bishop is pinned, the knight is trying to babysit the bishop there, and we just don't really have a clear follow-up, and black has a huge material lead. Okay, so we're starting to get familiar with hitting a brick wall, but how do we use that resistance to our advantage? Well, the big problem here is that we'd love to promote our pawn, but the rook capturing our hanging rook and then attacking our king is a big problem. Well, on the other hand, when I promoted the pawn into a queen, basically it forces black to play a good move, taking our rook, right? But on the other hand, we could think about under-promoting, that is capturing the knight, and under-promoting to a knight. Now this way, because 2 pieces are attacking the king, neither can be captured, because you can't capture both pieces at the same time, so the king needs to move here. Now, if the king moves to e8, we're quite happy. We can play not rook to e7, look out for the pin there, but rather queen to e7, mate in 1. But on the other hand, what if black moves the king to g8? That's a big problem. Notice we can't swing over here to attack the king. Once again, the rook is pinned to the king, and we're not making any progress here. We're not making any progress, I say, but on the other hand, you might wonder, well, wait a minute, I can just take the queen. And after black plays a move like rook takes rook, you might wonder, like, well, why isn't white just winning? We could just take the rook, right? Well, here, there's a little sting in the tail. We're up a queen for a moment, but here comes the fork. Once we move our king out of harm's way, black happily collects our queen, and when the smoke clears, we're suddenly down material. Now, rather than capturing the rook, you might be like, well, wait a minute, we don't have to allow this fork. We could just move our king to b1, and this nearly works, if not for the incredible rook a1. Like a magnet, we attract the king back into the corner, can't move here because of the knight. So once the king captures our rook, now once again, it's fork town. Boom. The knight forks the king and the queen, and we lose material. So what is our big problem here? Well, our rook is hanging and it's pinned, and black has no shortage of pieces ready to cause some mayhem here. Now, how do we use hitting a brick wall to our advantage? We need to find a way to sort of corral the king and keep it in the center, right? We talked about the idea of under-promoting, and that when the king moved, or if the king moved to e8, well, now we have really good potential here. The queen and king are lined up. More on that later. And here, rather than capturing the queen, we pointed out there is a mate in 1. So we need to figure out how to keep the king in the center. because once the king is able to hide here, basically all of the action that we want to see is over here, and the king is completely out of the drama. So we want to try to attract the king into the center. And one move to think about here, looks kind of crazy, is queen e7. And it's incredibly forcing because if the king declines our gift, then it's mate in 1. So the only thing we'd have to calculate would be queen to e7 and the king accepting our sacrifice. Now, if you're trying to look at this ahead of time, you might think, well, what's the value in attracting the king there? If I sack my queen, king captures, you can say, sure, now I can deliver another double check there against the king with the queen and the rook working together. But unfortunately, the king can capture the queen. And now what, right? Big problem here once again. Before you sacrifice your queen, we might want to wonder, well, what are the new checks available? Meaning, if we visualize that the king moves here, we've sacked our queen. Well, we already pointed out we could promote our pawn into a queen and attack the king, but that didn't quite work out. How else could we benefit from the king moving to e7? Now, rather than promoting the pawn on the d8 square, what if we promote the pawn on c8? Again, looks kind of pointless because our rook is hanging and we run into that same problem. But wait a minute. Who says we have to promote that pawn into a queen? Notice, by moving the king to e7, a new attacking resource can be found if we promote that pawn into a knight, which would then reveal a double check against the king. So that is a move that makes me feel a little more encouraged. Now, I'm not going to try to calculate every complication before making any moves. I don't want to dizzy you with too many arrows. But my point is, we hit brick wall after brick wall. And one of the problems is that the king is able to hide from the main theater of action. So when you look at a move that on the surface you almost want to kind of hand wave and be like, no way is that possible. Well, why not? It turns out this is the key move in our puzzle solution, queen to e7. It's not your first, second, or third candidate move, but when you hit brick wall after brick wall, either the puzzle is wrong or there's a really subtle resource to be discovered. And in this case, the brilliant queen sacrifice is what brings everything together. So we lure the king into the center because if the king moves away, we get mate in 1. So nothing else to calculate. The king must capture our queen. And like we mentioned before, promoting into a queen isn't going to work out. You promote this way, black happily captures, and now what, right? If we promote the pawn into a queen here, again, we have a big problem because of rook takes rook. Our king is under fire, our queen is hanging, not working out either. But the new resource with the king attracted or lured to the e7 square is the very subtle under promotion. You don't capture the knight, but you step on the empty square, promoting not to a queen, but under promoting to a knight. Both the knight and rook are in harm's way, but because both of them are attacking the king, they're immune from capture. And the only move you have to calculate, right, is here. Because the king can't move here because of the knight, can't move here because of the rook, can't move here because of the rook. So the only legal move, king to e8. And you have to be careful because you might have been really excited from afar. If you found this really cool sacrifice, you'd be like, okay, the knight is guarding e7. It's lights out. It's lights out. Okay, before we report another bug, why isn't this mate in 1? Aha, the rook is pinned to our king. So we have to also kind of navigate that traffic. This is what makes it so difficult, right? We sacked a queen, we lured the king here, and we have to anticipate not rook e7, but rather by luring the king to e8, the queen is pinned, it's unable to deal with anything invading these squares. Therefore, the path is clear for the knight to deliver a stunning mate. Notice there's no opportunity to capture the knight because of the pin, and the king is unable to escape thanks to our rook there.